about the elements of cost. What does it mean by cost? Cost, it may be defined as the monetary value of all sacrifices made to achieve an objective. For example, is producing goods and services. What is the meaning of cost? It says that cost is the sacrifice made, usually measured by the resources given up to achieve a particular purpose in our product cost and also in our periodic cost. What does it mean by product cost? Product cost is the cost that assigned to goods that were either purchased or manufactured for resale, while the period cost is the cost that identify with the period in which they are incurred. When you said costing, costing is simply cost finding. Finding, it can be defined as the technique and the process of ascertaining cost. Costing is classifying, recording, and appropriate allocation of expenditure for the cost determined of the product or services. We have the three major elements of cost. What are those? We have the materials, we have the labor, and we have the expenses. Let's talk about one by one. What is materials? Materials are those commodities supplied to undertaking. While the labor, those are the costs of paying employees, includes salaries, the bonuses, and so on. While the expenses, those are the costs other than material and labor. So, those are the three major elements of cost. In our elements of cost, the three major elements is we have the material, the labor, and the expenses. But under material, we have two types again. We have the direct material and indirect material. While in our labor, we also have direct labor and indirect labor. And while in our expenses, we have direct expenses and indirect expenses for our elements of cost. Let's talk about direct material. As we have discussed before, that direct material, generally, it becomes a part of the finished product. Example is the fiber for spinning wheel, sugar cane for sugar factory. So those are the direct material. While indirect material, those are the one which is unnecessary in production process but not become the integral part of the product. So what are the examples? The oil, the grease, sandpaper, which is used by the manufacturing businesses. In our labor, we have direct labor and indirect labor. So, in our direct labor, those are the wages paid directly to the employees, which is engaged in converting raw materials into finished product directly. So, what are the examples? We have the cider. Cider is the one who's making the sugar. We have the indirect labor as well. When you said indirect labor, those are the wages paid to employees, but those who are not completely engaged in the production process. For example, security guards. And for our expenses, we have direct expenses and indirect expenses. Direct expenses, we have those expenses which is specifically incurred on particular job or product. For example, power or electricity, design cost. So those are the example of the direct expenses. How about the indirect expenses? Indirect expenses are those indirect costs other than indirect material and indirect labor are termed as indirect expenses. What are the examples? we have the telephone bill, rent, insurance, and so on. So again, for our prime cost, how are we going to find our prime cost? Prime cost is we have three: the total of direct material, the total of direct labor, and the total of direct expenses. Is it easy to understand now? How about our overheads? What are the examples? Our overheads, those are considering the indirect material, indirect labor, and indirect expenses. Another overheads, we have the production overhead, office and administration overhead, selling and distribution overheads. So those are the types of overheads expenses. So let us review how to find the prime cost. We have the direct material, the total of direct labor, and the direct expenses. And what are the overheads that we have? Indirect material, indirect labor, and indirect expenses. So, in manufacturing companies, those prime costs include the direct material, direct labor, and direct expenses. While the factory costs include the direct material, direct labor, and direct expenses plus the production overhead. Now, what are the costs of the productions include? Of course, we have the direct materials, the direct labor, direct expenses, plus or added with the production overhead and added with those office and administration overhead. So those are the costs of the production include. How about our cost of sales? Our cost of sales include the cost of the production from the previous that I have given and added with the selling and distribution overhead. So those are from the materials, the labors, the expenses. So what are the one which is considered for materials? We have direct materials and indirect materials. For our labor, we have direct labor and indirect labor. And for our expenses, we have direct expenses and indirect expenses. So far, that's all for today. Hopefully, you understand more about manufacturing.